What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter. And
everyone is pointing to Barack right now, President Obama, as saying, you got to get the economy together. You got to get the economy together. When in fact, the president has very little to do with the economy. It's the Federal Reserve chairman that at least sets the policy. The president can appoint, or the president does appoint the Federal Reserve chairman, but after that, that's a privately owned company, the Federal Reserve Bank. They set the agenda.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter. And
viewer questions again for you, sir. Two in a row here. One from Facebook from Tracy McReynolds, who wrote in saying the U.S. central bank was unconstitutional for many reasons that have come to fruition. And Mohammed Awala Ahmed, also via Facebook, wrote in saying, I read on the internet that the Federal Reserve is really not a government-owned organization, as most people are made to believe, but a private company. And is it true that the Federal Reserve is not a bank in the same way that other countries have a central bank?
Well, I can't compare it to all the other central banks. I can talk about what we have here. And there is a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation on that. Some people say it's private. It's not strictly private in the sense of having a private company, but it's very, very secret, run by private individuals for their benefit. So in many ways it's private in that manner. But it is a creature of the government. We had to pass a law, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created the Federal Reserve, and we're supposed to be responsible for it, and we can end it tomorrow if we wanted to. So it is a government agency, but I like to use the word secret and out of the control by choice, by the congressional choice, that there's no oversight. So that to me is the real problem.
I have to start off by asking, you want to end the Fed. I mean, there's been plenty of movements to audit the Fed, but to end it completely seems a bit harsh. What would you have in its place?
Well, you really don't need anything, and auditing is the first step, and my bill to do that is making great progress here in the House of Representatives. But you really don't need a central bank. The world's had central banks for a long time, and we have a lot of economic problems. The Fed has flunked. We've had it since 1913. They've taken a dollar that was worth $1 then, and now it's worth 4 cents. It's supposed to give us stable prices, and that means prices have gone up significantly. They give us the business cycle. They have an unemployment rate now in the United States, as measured by free market economists, of 20%. So I would say that they have failed. They have also instructed to keep stable interest rates. Interest rates fluctuate between 21% and 1%, or even less than 1%. So as far as their record goes, I don't know how anybody could argue that they've done a good job, or how they could argue that the Federal Reserve deserves to have even more power.
Well, so you know, we get our viewers' questions on this, and we had one sent by Facebook to us from Yvonne Renee Davis, who, talking on your argument to scrap the Fed, says, how does Mr. Paul get more support for this powerful assertion that many Americans also subscribe to?
Well, you get support by educating people. I'm as much involved in education as I am in political activity, because I'm not a powerful committee chairman here, and I have nothing to trade with other members to get their vote. But the American people are very frightened, and they're concerned about the value of the money. They're very concerned that they lost a lot of their savings because of the financial crisis. And once they understand that the Federal Reserve has a lot to do with this, they get very concerned. But they became very concerned when they started seeing Congress coming up with programs like the TARP program, where Congress authorized $700 billion. Then we found out not too long after that that there was no monitoring of it, and nobody knows where the money goes. And then when they heard that the Federal Reserve can create money on their own, out of thin air, bail out banks, bail out corporations, make deals with other countries and other central banks, and get involved in international financial organizations and say, whoa, this is too much. So education of the people will wake them up to what needs to be done. It's the support of the people that is behind this movement.
So we had, you talk about ending the Fed now. In terms of, you've explained some of the impact on America, but what about the impact on the global economy? What result would you expect that to have?
Well, hopefully a lot better, because think of the impact of the dollar reserve standard that the world has accepted since 1971. That created the biggest financial bubble in the history of the world. And it has come to an end. Now they're already scurrying around. What are we going to use to replace the dollar? Are we going to use SDRs or Chinese yuan, or are we going to have a basket of currencies? Because they do not believe that the dollar reserve standard is going to resume its role in world affairs once again. So it's not so much wondering what would happen if we get rid of the dollar. It's wondering, figuring out exactly why it was that the dollar reserve standard caused this problem. And now we have to decide what we're going to replace it with, and obviously another paper currency isn't going to do it. You can't paste it together with the euro. The euro is no stronger than the dollar, except on short-term basis. So one day we'll wake up and find out that it's in the interest of the American people and the financial markets of the world to have a currency you just can't print out of thin air.
Well, Congressman, I know in your book, End the Fed, you talk about honest money connected to the gold standard, but we've reached a situation, of course, where there's not enough gold in the world to support any gold-backed currency, especially the dollar. When you say having to look for an alternative, what do you see as a possible alternative?
Well, I disagree with that there's not enough gold. There's always enough gold as long as you have prices adjust. So if you have a loaf of bread today that costs you $3 and it could cost a dime, all of a sudden you have tremendously expanded the money supply in terms of gold. The purchasing power grows. Gold expands at the rate of 3% per year, exactly the same amount that Milton Friedman wanted to expand the money supply under the monetarism. And expanding the money supply some years 10 and 15%, and recently 100%, and then dropping it down to zero when they want to make a correction, that makes no sense at all. No, that's a red herring to say there's not enough gold in the world. If the purchasing power of gold goes way up, there's an incentive to mine gold. The big reason why nobody wants it is the market decides how much money there should be in the marketplace and what the interest rates should be. Instead, is somebody secretly deciding how much money there should be and who gets to spend it first. This is the reason governments grow, because this is the reason why we've been able to fight all these wars around the world, because we don't have to be responsible. We just go and spend the money and print it. So we monetize the debt, and we get ourselves involved overseas, and we get ourselves in great debt here in this country running a welfare state. So those who like big government, the conservatives and liberals, like big government for different reasons, but they have to have the Fed that takes care of them by monetizing them.
Now called End the Fed, already on the New York Times bestseller list, I might add. One listens to your answers now in this conversation about Afghanistan. One prepares to go into a conversation now with you about this new book called End the Fed. One gets the impression that Ron Paul, although a member of Congress, doesn't trust government. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't trust I wouldn't say all government at all times, but I would say that most Americans, including myself, don't fully trust that the government's taking very good care of us. They don't have a good foreign policy, and there's something very untrustworthy about our monetary system. Very, very untrustworthy and very unfair, that it takes care of Wall Street at the same time. It hurts the people because they end up with the inflation, they end up with the unemployment, they end up with losing their houses, and yet the Federal Reserve, behind the scenes, in secret, can create trillions of dollars and bail out companies like Goldman Sachs. They can deal with world banks around, world central banks and other governments, and we're not even allowed to know the Congress is so derelict in their responsibility, and this is why I, of course, want an audit of the Fed, but indeed what we'll eventually have to have is ending the Fed, because they're going to destroy our money. We're in the process of doing that. They set the stage for destroying the financial system, and that has collapsed, but now they're just embarking on endless inflation, double the money supply, run up the debt, and spend and not even worry about it. We'll print the money if we need it. That is a devastation to the average person, and it will. And in countries where it gets out of control, the middle class gets wiped out, and that's what I'm afraid could happen here.
You know, there are those who are watching right now, no doubt, who will say that you got it all wrong, that not only should the Fed not be ended, were we to do something like that, the timing could not be worse, because it is the Fed and it's Congress, who you're saying was derelict in their duty, who put the money, pumped the money back into Wall Street, that turned this situation around. Now they're celebrating on Wall Street and passing out bonuses. And, of course, the line is that jobs are always the last thing to come around. That's the last indicator. But how do you respond to those who say that this would be a bad idea, the wrong time for this idea, and were it not for us pumping money into Wall Street, the economy might not be making a turn right about now?
Well, there's a half-truth there. The TARP funds did go there to a large degree, and we did prop up a lot of those businesses. Of course, that's why some politicians go to Wall Street to raise money for the political campaigns. But the Federal Reserve pumps in trillions, and we're not even allowed to know. TARP funds, people caught on, and they demanded from Congress, what's going on here? Why don't you find out? What are there any strings attached? So as bad as the TARP funds are, and as bad as what the Congress has done, the Federal Reserve is that much worse. Now, the answer to the other question about, it could be chaotic getting rid of the Fed, but if you read my book carefully, and I've talked about this for many, many years about a transition, even in the foreign policy, everything I talk about, how you get from one step to the next stage. And what I suggest here is not abolishing the Federal Reserve tomorrow, but legalizing some competition against the Federal Reserve, legalize the Constitution, legalize sound money. Parallel currencies are operating all the time around the world.
What would competition against the Federal Reserve look like? Describe that for me.
Well, gold coins and gold savings accounts could be used. And today, if you use gold and silver as legal tender, you go to jail. And yet the law and the Constitution said only gold and silver can be legal tender. But the courts always rule that the only legal tender is what the IRS said, and that's Federal Reserve notes. But there's no law that says Federal Reserve notes are dollars. And so it's total chaos, and that's why you have a financial system in chaos. But you can legalize competition. For instance, in Mexico, the middle class and the poor have been wiped out several times because their peso goes to zero, and all their money becomes worthless. But in Mexico now, if you want to save, you can put it in silver. And the accounts will be backed by silver, which means that you're not going to lose. The lower the peso goes, the higher your silver prices go up. You could do that in this country, and you could have a transition. And if you wanted to use Federal Reserve notes, you could. But other people could get paid for and make payments. And with the computer age, this is no big problem. I mean, if you go to Mexico, you can translate dollars into pesos very, very easily. So it could be done, rather than looking for chaos and closing down the system. But if you continue to do what we're doing now, you are going to have chaos, because you're going to have a runaway inflation, destruction of the dollar. Now that is real chaos, not what I'm suggesting. Real chaos, not what I'm suggesting.
Go back for me right quick and unpack what you were trying to say when you mentioned a moment ago that there are examples around the world where when these issues go unabated, go unaddressed, the middle class gets wiped out. Make the connection between the Fed and the middle class being wiped out.
Okay, if the Fed continues to inflate the currency, that is, print money, the dollar loses value, which it's doing all the time. Mexico has had runaway inflation. Central American countries have had runaway inflation. We know about the runaway inflation in Germany, or the most recent one in Zimbabwe. The money goes to zero value, and the people lose out. But the very rich don't lose out. They get bailed out, and they don't care about the cost of living. Right now, they claim the cost of living isn't going up, and the elderly aren't being hurt. Well, the elderly didn't get a cost of living increase this year on Social Security, but the cost of living for them is going up. Sometimes it goes up much faster for somebody living on a fixed income than somebody living on Wall Street. But here, instead of helping those people, we help Wall Street, and they're making
billions of dollars. They have $120 billion in the bank now to hand out in bonuses this year. At the same time, we have a 20% unemployment rate. I mean, there's something very unfair about this system.
You mentioned the Federal Reserve. And, you and I have worked on the idea of an audit. It's bringing out a few things that we didn't know. They're apparently printing a lot of money, buying our own debt. What is the solution with the Federal Reserve? Do we need to return to a gold standard? You talk a lot about sound money. Exactly what would you do as president?
Well, the president has a limit to what he can do because the Federal Reserve was created by the Congress. It could be restrained by the Congress. It could be eliminated by the Congress. But the most important thing is for the people to understand the business cycle. Who causes the business cycle and how do we get into recessions and depression? And that has to do with the Federal Reserve. So you can't wave a wand and get Federal Reserve. Even I, who have written about and talked about the Federal Reserve, I don't say close the Federal Reserve down in one day. But I would like to at least see competition. Why can't we legalize the Constitution on money? Competing currency, let gold and silver be used for legal tender. Today, if you use gold and silver, you can go to prison. And the counterfeiters are over there at the Federal Reserve. So we need, and you join me and Steve as well on auditing the Fed is very important. I mean, what we found out, even though we didn't get the audit, we passed it in the House but not in the Senate, but what we got in the audit was that we found out in the bailout, the Fed was involved with $15 trillion passing out to their buddies, 1/3 of it going to foreign banks. I mean, this is such an outrage. It's bigger than the Congress itself. So it has to be reined in. And at a certain period of times in our history, Jefferson got rid of a central bank, Jackson got rid of a central bank. And when the issues of money goes before the people, they always vote for sound money because it makes sense to say, why should the politicians be able to spend at will and then just print money when they need it? And then they wonder why we get into trouble. So yes, we have to take the Fed on because it does cause the business cycle. If you want to understand recessions and depression, you have to understand the Federal Reserve System. Our founders detested the idea and understood the danger of allowing governments and central banks to print money out of thin air because that is guaranteed the government will spend too much money if the politicians know that there's somebody always there to print the money. That is the reason it's in there. No gold, only gold and silver can be legal tender. If we believe in liberty and believe in the Constitution, believe me, we would understand exactly what has made America great. Thank you very much.
At this time, recognize Mr. Powell, the subcommittee chair, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we hear that in the future we're going to have a better economy, and everybody hopes so. But it's hard to believe. It's hard for me to believe anyway, because I look back on our past 3 years and what Congress has done and what the Fed has done. We've literally injected about $5.3 trillion. And I don't think we got very much for it. The national debt went up $5.1 trillion. Real GDP grew less than 1%. So I don't think we've gotten a whole lot. Unemployment really hasn't recovered. We still have 7 million people that have become unemployed. And one statistic that is very glaring, if you look at the chart, is how long people are unemployed. The average time used to be 17 weeks. Now it's nearly 40 weeks they stay unemployed. So nothing there reassures me. And also, when we talk about prices, we're always reassured there's not all that much inflation, and we're told that they might start calculating inflation differently with a new CPI. Of course, we changed our CPI a few years back. There's still a free market group that calculates the CPI the old-fashioned way, and they come up with a figure, in spite of all this weak economy, that prices have gone up 35%, 9.4% every year. And I think if you just went out and talked to the average housewife, she'd probably believe the 9% rather than saying it's only 2%. So I would say what we've been doing isn't very reassuring with all this money expenditure. But my question is related to the overall policy. Spending all this money hasn't helped, And yet many allies that would endorse so much of what's been going on, whether it's the Fed or the Congress, they recognize that consumer spending is very, very important. And they concentrate on that. But the $5.1 trillion didn't go to the consumers. It went to buying bad assets. It went to bailing out banks. It went to bailing out big companies. And lo and behold, the consumer didn't end up getting this. They lost their job, and they lost their houses and mortgages, and they're still in trouble. But my question is, if you took that $5.1 trillion and said that consumer spending is good, you could have given every single person in this country $17,000. Why is it the program of both the Congress and the Fed to direct the money to the people who had been making a lot of money, instead to the people who, if you argue that the consumer needs to spend the money, I obviously don't advocate this, but I would suggest, you know, maybe it could have worked better. It couldn't have worked any worse. But what is the reason we direct it toward the banks and the big corporations, too big to fail, and we don't pay that much attention to the consumer if it's true, and I don't know if you agree with that or not, that consumer spending is an important issue?
Well, it is an important issue, Congressman, but you're mistaken in saying that the Federal Reserve has spent any money. You say $5 trillion. We have lent money. We have purchased securities. That's not buying, that's not dissipating, you know, the money. We've gotten all the money back. As an article over the weekend by Alan Sloan showed, in fact, the Fed has been a major profit center for the U.S. government. We've turned over profits in the last 2 years of $125 billion. So we are not costing any money in terms of budget deficits or anything like that. In terms of what we were trying to do, of course, the reason the Federal Reserve was founded a century ago was to try to address the problems arising from financial panics, which did, by the way, occur in an unregulated environment in the 19th century. We provided liquidity and short-term loans to help financial systems stabilize. We did that not because we particularly care about the managers or the shareholders of financial firms.
I hate to interrupt, but my time is about up. But I would like to suggest that you say it's not spending money. Well, it's money out of thin air. You put it into the market and you hold assets, and the assets aren't, you know, they are diminishing in value when you buy up bad assets. But very quickly, if you could answer another question, because I'm curious about this. You know, the price of gold today is $1,580. The dollar during these last 3 years was devalued almost 50%. When you wake up in the morning, do you care about the price of gold?
Well, I pay attention to the price of gold, but I think it reflects a lot of things. It reflects global uncertainties. I think the reason people hold gold is as a protection against what we call tail risk, really, really bad outcomes. And to the extent that the last few years have made people more worried about the potential of a major crisis, then they have gold as a protection.
Do you think gold is money?
No.
It's not money. Even if it had been money for 6,000 years, somebody reversed that and eliminated that economic law.
Well, it's an asset. I mean, it's the same. Would you say Treasury bills are money? I don't think they're money either, but they're a financial asset.
Why do central banks hold it?
Well, it's a form of reserves.
Why don't they hold diamonds?
Well, it's tradition, long-term tradition.
Well, some people still think it's money. I yield back. My time is up. Thank you.
Gingrich, you say that the unemployment problem in America has been made worse by the policies of the Federal Reserve. You call for auditing the Fed and stripping it of its banking powers. But Congressman Paul thinks the Fed needs to be abolished to create lasting prosperity. Why is the Fed worth saving?
Well, I think that having some kind of central bank is, in fact, an important part of how you deal with monetary policy in the modern world. But I would say to you that having Chairman Bernanke deal with hundreds of billions of dollars, and to some estimates are as much as $16 trillion, in secret, is profoundly against a free society. The Fed should be totally audited. It should be out in public. Their decision documents from 07 and 08 and 09 should be public. We should know who they bailed out and why they bailed them out and who they didn't bail out. And I think that it is a scandal that the Federal Reserve is secret. And I think that, frankly, their monetary policy since the late 90s has been a major factor in the bubble that has been created and a major factor in the economic pain we're now going through. So the Fed is certainly, going back as Reagan did to sound money, is certainly a key part of how you get back to prosperity. And the Fed is the primary villain in failing to have a sound money policy.
Congressman Paul? If I could follow up with you. Is Speaker Gingrich wrong to want to save the Fed?
Not exactly, because my position isn't that I'd close the door down immediately. You can phase it out. But there's some other things that we could do that in a transition phase. For instance, and I'm delighted that mainstream is catching up with us these days for auditing the Fed. This is great. But I've made a suggestion, which is a serious suggestion, and there's been quite a few who have supported me on this. We owe the Fed $1.6 trillion in Treasury bills. Where'd they get the money to buy it? They created it out of thin air. So we pay them interest. So that's on our books. So we literally, with legislation, could wipe $1.6 trillion off. That's not a solution to the monetary problem or our spending problems, but it would give you a year to work this out, and we wouldn't have had any of that debate going on. Those were all scare tactics to try to scare people into doing things. So, but that is one thing that we could do. But eventually, we have to deal with the Fed, because the Fed creates the business cycle. If you don't understand the business cycle, you don't know why we have recessions. The sooner we learn that, the better. Right now, we own foreigners $2.7 trillion. No wonder they have money to come back in here and buy stuff up, and then we object. But that has to do with our monetary system as well as our foreign policy. So if we want prosperity, we have to change our foreign policy. We have to live within our means, but we can't maintain a reserve currency where all our greatest export today are paper dollars. We create money out of thin air, and they still accept it as if it was backed by gold. Can you imagine how great a nation we'd have if we didn't have the Federal Reserve System printing all this money? And it goes without saying that when we have the proper size government and governments function in the proper manner, we certainly wouldn't need the IRS or the 16th Amendment.
Yeah. Big money. All the money in the country is manipulated by the Federal Reserve. But on monetary policy, now the new chairman, Barney Frank, told me that he says, I'm looking forward to it because you and I can work together in checking up on the Federal Reserve, which he's more than a Republican would do. So I'm encouraged by that. But Barney Frank is a liberal, and he wants the Fed to have lower interest rates, as a liberal would, and not understanding the whole issue. But where I think we'll make inroads is on more transparency. I think that we might be able to at least publicly pressure the Fed and maybe the working group on financial markets, find out what they're doing, and maybe at least put pressure on them to tell us how central bank coordination is used. Well, it's based on an illusion and a false trust, and it can't continue because the trust will eventually be lost. But Mises taught in Human Action that all money originates in the marketplace, so it has to have real value. And the dollar did originate. It originated as a silver dollar and had real value, and there was gold and silver, and throughout the 20th century that was undermined until it was finally totally destroyed in 1971. Right. So we've had this total fiat dollar since 1971. You say, well, why didn't it end? Why did it last for 35 more years? Well, it was because of the origination. There are still members, believe this or not, there are still members on the banking committee that believe that the dollar is backed by gold.
You've got to be kidding.
No, I'm not kidding. They still do, and they're very disinterested. But they'll come and say, "Isn't the dollar backed by gold?" Well, no, not quite.
One of my long-term goals has always been to emphasize maintaining the integrity of the monetary unit, rather than looking superficially at some of our statistics. But I also share the concern of the chairman of the committee of our responsibilities for oversight and your interest as well, Chairman Bernanke, on having the transparency that I think we all desire. Transparency in monetary policy is a goal we should all support. I've often wondered why Congress has so willingly given up this prerogative over monetary policy. Congress, in essence, has ceded total control of the value of our money to a secretive central bank. Congress created the Federal Reserve, yet it had no constitutional authority to do so. we forget that those powers not explicitly granted to the Congress by the Constitution are inherently denied to the Congress. And thus, the authority to establish a central bank was never given. Of course, Jefferson and Hamilton had that debate early on, and the debate seemingly was settled in 1913. But transparency and oversight are something else, and they're worth considering. Congress, although not by law, essentially has given up all its oversight responsibilities over the Fed. There are no true audits. Congress knows nothing of the conversations, the plans, and the action taken in concert with other central banks. We get less and less information regarding the money supply each year, especially now that we don't even have access to M3 statistics. The role the Fed plays in the President's secretive working group on financial markets goes essentially unnoticed by Congress. The Federal Reserve shows no willingness to inform Congress voluntarily about how often the working group meets, what action it takes that affects the financial markets, or why it takes these actions.